Hey, everybody, and welcome to Healthy Living. My guest today is Dr. Vera Tarman. She is the Medical Director of Renascent, which is one of the largest drug and alcohol treatment centers in Canada, where she also treats food addictions. I consider her one of the leading experts on food addiction, and she's also the author of a wonderful book called Food Junkies. Welcome, Dr. Tarman. It's so great to talk to you again. I really learned so much from you.
Hi, Chef AJ. I'm always delighted to be here. And yes, here is my book, Food Junkies.
It's such a great book because I think looking at you now, slender, people don't realize you actually are or were a food addict and you actually were obese. It's hard to believe looking at you now.
Yes, and it's hard, but I remember it very, very well, and I don't want to go there again. And luckily, I think that a lot of us who are on the road teaching this message are compelled because of our own private stories. And I certainly have my own story of having been over 100 pounds and being off of it coming back for about 10 years. Yeah. So anyway, and a lot of us are in that situation.
I love that you tell your personal story in the book. I've always wondered, because I've interviewed you so many times, that we've never actually talked about what do you do at Renascent. It's in Canada, so probably most of the people in the United States would never be able to come, but what do you do in a food addiction treatment center?
Okay, so Renascent is basically a drug and alcohol treatment center, and I'm the medical director for that. So I would say 80% of my work or 85% of my work is overseeing general addiction care in a residential setting. But we, a few years ago, got a large donation to open up a food addiction part of that program. And so we built into the program that we have a food addiction piece. And this was really quite a new experience, unusual, because most of the time when people go into residential care for disordered eating, they're going in because they have what's called an eating disorder. But you couldn't get in just by food addiction into a food addiction program, an addiction program, because it's not acknowledged as a diagnosis. But what we did because of this donation, so we weren't held by the Ministry of Health or any funding body that was only willing to pay for addiction per se. We were able to do our own piece, carve out a piece of our program and focus only on people who identified as food addicts. And in that first year, we got something like 80 people signing up. So it gave us a really nice idea of how food addiction plays itself out alongside with other addicts and how similar the pattern of behavior was and where there were differences. And what we did in the food thing is we decided, well, we have to first of all offer a food abstinent plan, because just like the people who are coming in had to be abstinent from alcohol or cocaine or whatever, these people that came in had to be abstinent of trigger foods. So what we identified was what we thought was the biggest umbrella of addiction foods that were out there. And we kind of made the assumption that if a person was coming in and giving up 4 weeks of their life in a residential setting, sharing, a room with somebody else, all that stuff, they had to be pretty extreme. It wouldn't be like just, I want to lose a little bit of weight. And we actually weeded those people out, because it was not about weight loss. It was about stopping the obsession. And we figured that we were going to open the umbrella of addictive foods as far as possible, saying to people, you may not need to be abstinent from all of these when you leave, but we're going to start with this. And then when you leave, under the care of not yourself, but either a food sponsor or a dietitian or somebody who knows about food addiction, you may be able to reintroduce some of the foods. So we said for sure no sugar, because sugar is, we're seeing the science just supporting over and over how addictive it is. And our contention was, eat enough addictive foods and you can actually develop a food addiction syndrome, its own momentum, its own little animal, addictive impulse in the brain. So sugar, we figured that flour was, because it's processed, it's basically refined carbohydrates to the point where it's almost sugar. We threw that in the basket. And then we discovered that because most of the people we were attracting were women, postmenopausal. That's certainly not the whole picture of who food addicts are, but these were the people that were actually seeking treatment. They'd already been on multiple diets, they'd already had surgery in many cases, and they were like pretty extreme, and often women postmenopausal. And we found that we often had to knock off the grains. So it ended up being no sugar, no flour, no grains, with the idea that you might be able to reintroduce that. Knowing, by the way, Chef AJ, that there are food addiction plans out there that are valid and worthy that do include grains. We decided, though, that we were going to exclude that and leave that later. Just like we were going to exclude dairy, we were going to exclude sweeteners, but we know that some people can eat those things. But we were not going to do that. So that we could get people clean, squeaky clean, stop the obsession, and then start to work on delivering the tools of addiction. So that's basically what we did. Offer an abstinent food plan, of which I've just described, and then start teaching them multiple tools to stay clean once you leave the program 4 weeks later.
That's incredible. So they all come together and they all stay the same 4 weeks, or is it a stop and start at different times?
It was in that period of time when it was a donation. Then it was people just came in because there were enough people coming in. As long as there were at least 2 or 3 at a time, in and amongst all the other people, the cocaine addicts and alcoholics, etc., we would all be sitting at the same table, more or less. As long as there were enough, like 2 or 3 or 4, it could be continuous. Now, because the donation is dried up, it's no longer there, we have to charge people, and so there's far fewer numbers, and now we do try to cluster them to 2 or 3 or 4 at a time.
That's an incredible investment of one's life. They must be, like you say, very extreme in their food addiction to give up for weeks and pay a lot of money to be in it. And I can't imagine, what do they do all day?
In the program?
Yeah.
Well, it's the same as, I mean, believe it or not, one of the 2 most important things that we offer, because we have a 5-day as well, and the 5 days an outpatient, and it allows you to get the theory of all this stuff. But the month in there, you're actually living it. And believe it or not, the same as the alcoholic, cocaine addict, whatever, if you're in an environment where you're virtually tied down, I mean, you're not really tied down, but you know, whenever you walk out and come in, people are looking in your purse to make sure you're not bringing anything in. They're making sure you're staying sober for a month. That's a big deal. A lot of people cannot do that. And with addiction, it's the first 2 or 3 weeks that you got to get through. And then when you're through it, I mean, you know, you and I, we're not suffering. We're not white knuckling, not being able to eat sugar. It's actually very easy now, but it wasn't initially. So that being in an environment where you can't, and you get through that, that's a big deal. And plus you're being told what foods are easy to eat and stuff. So what are you doing all day? It almost doesn't matter. It's the time. But what we're doing all day is we're in group and we're doing the rest of it. What are the tools that I need to learn? Like you and I were talking just before this podcast, the family. You know, how do you talk to a family who says, it's your birthday, come on, or you've lost all this weight, now you can eat this food. You know, you can't eat this food anymore, and you have to have tools, diplomatic tools, to keep yourself safe. And you can read them on a list, but what we learn in the program through continuous, it's not really repetition, but working through examples, watching other people in group. Okay, that's how I'm going to do this. This is how I'm going to deal with the fact that I can no longer hang out with you because you won't let go of these toxic things. And I'm going to have to stop seeing, like all those kinds of things.
That sounds very valuable, like, because I find that, like, people understand drug and alcohol addiction, whether they are drinkers or drug users, but with food, there seems to either be a lack of awareness or an insensitivity. So, for example, if you knew a friend or a colleague or a loved one was an alcoholic, you would probably respect that and not like tempt them with alcohol and say, but please, I made this margarita just for you. Why can't you have a sip? But when it comes to food, it's so people either think we're crazy or being difficult, and they don't understand it. Like, I get a lot of clients that are females and their husbands say, well, I'm not going to keep a house without the treats I want. You need some willpower and self-control. You need to push yourself away from a table. But you would never say to an alcoholic, you know, you need to push yourself away from a bar. You would say to the alcoholic, you need to not go into the bar.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's almost like the difference of recognizing that foods are addictive versus you can actually have an addiction syndrome now. So that means that even when there's no going back, like you might have been, the person that you live with might be able to stop at, at one bag of chips. But if you've gone to that point where you're used to the box, the box of 20 bags of chips, you can't go back to one. And if you use the addiction understanding of what's actually happened in the brain, the rewiring, the consolidation of unfortunate connections, you're not going back to the one bag of chips anymore. And recognizing that that's actually, it's not just that the foods are addictive and they're hard to say no to, but you're changed, and there's no going back. And we're not recognizing that piece is still to be determined in the medical literature.
Well, I know you're doing everything to make it, the awareness of this as an actual disorder, even though it has a terrible name, food addiction. I think once we talked and we said we should call it dopamine deficiency disorder or something that sounds like, because food addiction is not the greatest name, of course.
That's right. And some people find food addiction or junk food addiction. I mean, there's different things. But it ends up being, I think that unfortunately food, although it's so nonspecific, is still sometimes the best one, because when you've reached that remember I was talking about this phenomena that happens, food addiction. If you're at the extreme end of that, you can be addicted to healthy foods like carrots, Brussels, maybe not Brussels sprouts because you're going to get full so quickly, but you can get eating behaviors themselves, binging on healthy foods. So it expands beyond just the foods, although it starts initially with the foods.
So you're saying it can take 4 weeks for people for their brains to really calm down and get, like, it almost sounds like a detox. The fact that people go through such horrible detox, to me, just shows how addictive sugar flour is. Do you see a similar detox in the people that are detoxing off sugar flour and the ones that are detoxing off of, more, well, I don't know if it's more serious drugs. That's what I've been told, that it's not as serious as drug and alcohol addiction.
Yes, I do. But it depends on. It's like you have to choose your hell. Like if you are coming off of an opiate or alcohol, that's a fairly dramatic withdrawal. Like you can have even a seizure or vomiting, diarrhea, etc. It's very obvious, but it's also fairly quick because the addiction itself. The impact of the addiction is bigger and stronger and faster. If you do something that is a gradual, slow progression of addiction, like tobacco or like marijuana or like food, you don't see the dramatic damage until later on. And similarly, the withdrawal is not so dramatic, big, but it's long, it's protracted. So a marijuana withdrawal can take literally weeks and weeks and weeks, or as opposed to days. Like with cocaine or crack, it's weeks. And similarly with it's like sugar is slow-mo alcohol. Alcohol might take 2 or 3 weeks to withdraw. Sugar will take 2 or 3 months. It's longer. And I can die of, another way to say it is I can die of cirrhosis with alcohol if I'm drinking hard, after maybe 7 or 10 years of hard use. It's going to take maybe 17 or 20 years of hard use with sugar, but I'm dying of the same thing. And so similarly with the withdrawal, it's just as awful, but lower grade, almost under the radar. And people will often be experiencing withdrawal, think, oh, I'm depressed, and go off and run and get an antidepressant without actually realizing that's not the cause of their mood disorder, that there's a mood disorder per se. It's because of the withdrawal that they haven't even seen because it's under the radar.
Right, and they probably have been using sugar and flour so long that they don't even recognize. I remember when I became a sugar sober on Sunday, July 6, 2003. I was actually at an inpatient facility. Well, it wasn't a hospital. It's called the Optimum Health Institute. And, we did green juices, things like that. And I remember detox was a bitch. I remember it took a good week of, headaches and crying and abdominal pain and diarrhea. But when it was over, I was like a new person. I remember coming home and my dogs didn't recognize me. I was so calm. And I just remember. So what kind of symptoms are your inpatients exhibiting?
Well, The initial is, first of all, cravings, and they say, I'm feeling deprived. And this is often where doctors and people who don't buy into this concept will say, see, you're just depriving the person, and that's no good. They're just going to want more than they wanted before. And we just say, yeah, just sit through that. It's just part of the withdrawal. Get over it. They'll get over it. Anyway, so there's that sense of withdrawal, irritability, obsession. How am I going to sleep without my nightly nightcap of Haagen-Dazs ice cream? That's what it was for me. So there's anxiety, there's insomnia, there's those kinds of symptoms in the initial week or two. Then what happens is, because people, like you kind of alluded to this, are using the drug to self-medicate, either withdrawal or just other moods. If you've been using sugar and food to deal with issues, now you've got the issues and the emotion, the raw emotion, without the ability to self-medicate. So what happens is the initial withdrawal is, this is what we saw in our pilot project when we had like 80 or 90 people. This pattern of behavior where people would get over the major physical stuff in 10 days or so that they're actually sleeping better now and not as cranky and not as anxious. But then they had all these emotions, and what do they do with their emotions? And become really afraid of them, because it's like suddenly they're huge. And, we saw the same pattern with our drug addicts, but the drug addicts had sugar to use. And the sugar addicts no longer even had that. That was like the last defense against raw emotion that you haven't looked at for years because you've been using sugar. So we saw a lot of people getting quite overcome in maybe the second and third week, or third and fourth week, with that. And if I were to build a program now that could be longer than the month we have, it would be on what do we do with the underlying trauma, which might eventually make the person relapse.
Wow. I find that with the sugar, people know that sugar's not good. Some use it, some don't. But I find it even harder to get people off the bread, the flour, the pasta, because and that seems to be just as, if not more than, addictive. Could you talk about why that is? Because people know that sugar's addictive. They've read the stuff about the brain scans and the MRIs, but you tell them, maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of people, bread, flour, pasta are just, it's the same.
It's the same. And, it's the same. And if we were, I would say it's the same. So we're talking now, instead of just sugar, we're talking now flour. And then ultimately we could be talking about grains. But let's just stay with the sugar and flour, because I think there's no question that those are highly triggering. And I don't know if you can ever desensitize that trigger. But, on the glycemic index, bread and pasta, breaks down into sugar fairly quickly. And the brain, and it's not just that it breaks down quickly, but it's also in a huge amount. If you really could just have one piece of bread, every day or two, you could probably get away with that. But that's not how we eat in our society. We eat in our society in such a way that it's either oatmeal or it's or cereal. Let's just call it cereal, or it's bread or toast or pasta, all in the same day. So what we're doing is overwhelming pseudo sugar, because it is almost sugar, into our system, so that what I might have been able to get away with a little bit, I can't, because it's basically too much. And these things break down into sugar fairly quickly because they're refined. I think it was you actually that used this word, and I keep using it now. It's been pre-digested for us through the food industry, so that it's almost sugar.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So why do you think that, because I personally eat whole grains, eat gluten-free grains. I've heard from some food addiction people that whether you eat grains or not, you should avoid gluten, because the gluten does have some kind of effect, like it turns to gluteomorphine in the brain. Have you heard that? Do you agree with that?
Yeah. So I think yes, I do. So if you're coming from my perspective, which is let's knock out every trigger food we can, there would be an advantage to doing that. But I do want to acknowledge that there is a degree of severity with food addiction. And a person can be at an earlier stage or a younger stage where their body is more resilient. So that as long as they're not overwhelmed, like you, Chef, you eat grains, but I'm sure that's not all what you're eating all day. You're not eating just grains. It's
Correct.
a little bit.
And I don't eat bowls of white rice. I eat grains as part of a meal that may have, something else like lots of vegetables and, some other, maybe like butternut squash, that kind of thing.
Like why is it that the Mediterranean diet, the classic one, not the one today, which is all pasta, was considered healthy for the longest time? The pasta was a condiment. It was just part of the larger picture, and I bet that's what you're doing. So my guess is that if a person is at a certain level, even foods like a little bit of bread here and there do metabolize quickly. If it's within a larger context and you're not that damaged, you're probably fine. Now, if a person's at the extreme end where, their life is 24/7 food and everything triggers them, it would probably be, I wouldn't say to somebody, you got to stop dairy, but I might with this person. So there's a sort of extreme end. I would say that one of the ways that we can determine that is, so how far is the person in terms of their development of their addiction, and using the glycemic index. If they're at the extreme end, I'm going to avoid foods that are sort of anything over 50 or 60 on the glycemic index. I'm going to try to avoid and just go with the vegetables and the occasional fruit and whatnot.
Yeah.
But for the most part, if the person is not at that extent, they might be able to get away with a bit, not refined, because that's too much. Like you have to look at the foods and how quickly they break down, how refined they are. There's a lot of variables, I guess I'm trying to say.
Right. Well, my philosophy is that food addiction seems to be largely self-diagnosed. There are some tests, but it's not like with hypertension. If you go into the doctor, there's a certain number and you're considered hypertensive. Like you say, it does exist on a continuum. And my advice to people is, when in doubt, leave it out. And many of the doctors that I've interviewed say that dairy, for many people, including that it's calorically dense, is very addictive, because just like gluten turns to gluteomorphines, Dr. Barnard was saying how the casein turns to casomorphines, and the last thing we wanted for an addict is to
have more of that. That's right. And so even a little bit of that might be a trigger, whereas for somebody else who's not really that far along, that little bit may not be that much of a trigger, or it might be just okay. And the other thing is that it might be okay at one point in a person's life, and as they get older, like I often say, post-menopause, I think something else happens, and people have to be tighter. And they say, but this worked for me, but it may not work anymore, because there's a heightened sensitivity to some foods that there wasn't before.
Why do you think, because I agree, most of my work is with women that are older and either premenopausal, post-perimenopausal. Why do you think that things change at that point of a woman's life, and it does actually become more difficult with our food choices, and sometimes even to lose weight?
It's got to be with the sex hormones, the LDH and the estrogen and the progesterone. When a woman becomes postmenopausal, I like to say they are essentially like in, oh my gosh, am I going to remember it? What do you call it when you're on your period? The week
Menarche?
No, when you're the week before, when you're just nasty all the time.
PMS? No.
Yeah, thank you. PMS. I got to write that down so I remember it. You see, it's been so long since I've had to experience. So it's kind of like you're in PMS all the time. So when a person's PMSing, like that's the week before their period and during, they want to eat sugar way more than normal. Like they're just hypersensitive. So there's I think people become more the whole insulin hormonal pathways become more sensitive, and it just appears to, and maybe there's some element of weight metabolism slowing down too, thyroid, etc. That they just, a postmenopausal women tend to be more sensitive to the effects of all of this. That's when we get the middle-aged bulge, which is really just visceral adiposity. It's happening around the midriff, which is a sign of hyperinsulinemia, a high insulin. And that's got to do probably with the inability to tolerate starches that you couldn't tolerate before. So you have to cut those out, or cut them out more.
Right. Or find which ones work for you. You know, I find that it's that people really have to know that themselves, because I find that, you know, that like rice, like you say, for some of the people I work with, seems to be a trigger in that it's not that they can't eat it, but they'll exponentially eat, because there's something about rice that's intoxicating when it cooks and it smells, that they can eat more of it than, say, like butternut squash. But people have to find, you can't paint everybody with the same brush. They have to find what works for them. I find that chocolate is one of the things that people just really crave, that are people that are still having their periods.
Yeah. But, you know, I think that we can say, you're right. And that's actually why I like the work that you do, because you recognize the inherent pitfalls of some of these foods, and with that understanding of food addiction, which is what we need so much, especially in the vegan world, where it's I don't see it. You're the only person I know who has a really good understanding of that. And there's so many people who are food addicts who want to eat vegan, and I say, I don't know what to do other than read Chef AJ, but, you know.
Well, I appreciate that, and because one of the reasons that I appreciate and admire your work so much is because you really understand the food addiction piece and can articulate it in a way, because I work with so many wonderful doctors in the plant-based movement, and it's not that they don't care about this, but it's not where their focus is.
Oh, where their focus is, yeah. And I want to say that one of the things, like, you do understand is that you know, not all grades are created equal, and, you know, the whole idea of, I think we can both agree that there are some things that you just can't eat, and I don't think you would have advocated either, and that would be like the refined or non-whole grains.
Absolutely. Like, I find that instant oats are not, I tell people, if you're going to eat oats, for example, eat the whole unprocessed oat growth that takes an hour to cook, that came in nature. Don't eat the steel cut oat. Don't eat the rolled oat. Don't eat the instant oat, because it is, to me, as a former pastry chef, to me, it's almost like flour, because I know that, because with rolled oats, which is a very common healthy breakfast for some people, oatmeal and fruit, I know that as a pastry chef, that if I were to bake with rolled oats, it turns into flour. I did this yesterday in a cooking class. But I get a lot of flack, because I tell people that if you are having cravings, struggling with weight loss or food addictions, that a healthy breakfast for other people, which might be rolled oats and sweet fruit, might not be the ideal breakfast for you. That's why I recommend things like beans and greens, vegetables, savory breakfast, because I find that even with fruit, which I eat, and I think is delicious, usually putting berries in my salad, or maybe an apple for dessert, I find that people that are struggling with sugar addiction, it's best to start their day in a savory way and not hit it right away with what I call cake, which to me, rolled oats and fruit is cake.
I would totally agree, and you know, in my program, which is pretty tight, you know, like I said, we try to open the umbrella up as much as possible. You know, we will allow fruits, but they're very specific fruits. So berries are like number one on the list of good stuff, and we don't allow for cherries, we don't allow for bananas, because they're so high in fruit. And a person may well be able to eat that stuff, but I would be a little bit nervous about the people who want to then make it as part of some smoothie and all that. Like, that's basically making it some kind of version of dessert. And it takes what could be a safe thing out into a realm that's no longer safe. And that might be fine for the regular person out there in the world, but not for somebody who's been badly damaged through previous food, previous diets, other addictions. I can't tell you how many alcoholics and opiate users who are clean in our center, who are just snarfing down the sugar in any concoction that's possible, including pop. You know, it's and they didn't do that before. So there's something that's been damaged or hypersensitized, and so that I don't think they can get away with the grains that are, you know, the rolled or the cooked stuff with the fruit and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's.
Does it, whatever has been damaged, does it ever get repaired through abstinence? By the way, I'm going to be 60 in a few weeks, and on my 60th birthday, and I did not plan this, my 60th, the day before my 60th birthday, March 21st, is my 3,000th day of abstinence.
Wow. Congratulations. That's great. Well, Chef, you look great. And I like to say that I look pretty great too. I'm 63, and I'm going to say it's because that we eat abstinently. I will say you look better than I do. You look very good.
I eat a lot of Brussels sprouts.
Yeah, and so do I. So, you know, I think that one of the things I love about you is that you show that it's possible to eat vegan well, and if only people would, we got to get you up there. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sure you're
right. Well, so I really don't have a place in this world because the regular vegans hate me because I'm against the junk food, and you know I don't fit in with the food addiction people because I don't weigh and measuring. So I kind of like out there on my own. You know, you mentioned the word trigger food a few times, and I use that word as well. How do you, Dr. Tarman, personally define a trigger food, and are these different for different people?
Yeah, well, they are different for different people, although there are some universals like sugar and flour. And trigger foods are just any food. And the worse in the addiction you are, the more they accumulate. You get more and more. It's basically any food that makes you want more when you should be done because you're full. You know, the whole neurochemistry of eating, which is, I mean, you know, the thing about food addiction is that it is so powerful because our brain was made for food. It wasn't made for cocaine and alcohol. Cocaine and alcohol have just hijacked the food system. But you know, food is already there, and if the food that we're eating is tapping into that, that's why it's so powerful. So you take a food like an apple or a carrot or something like that, there's a certain amount of fructose, sugar, but there's a lot of fiber and water and everything that makes that food. And similarly with grains, the whole grains, that the fiber and the time it takes to digest, these are all mitigators against it becoming something that is overpowering in the brain to make it addictive. And a trigger food is something that's beat the system of that the brain tries to normalize or sort of make it within a norm that it can handle. So sugar is a trigger because I have a little bit, then I want more. Even though I'm actually full and I don't want more, I still want more than I don't. And it'll always win out as I want a bit more. And that feeling of wanting a bit more is actually the experience of dopamine itself, which sugar enhances, and also the anticipation of sugar enhances it, like through hunger or whatever. So anything that spurs that dopamine, which initially will be sugar, booze, maybe cigarettes, I think marijuana, that's why I'm not a great fan about this happening, the legalization in this context anyway, and foods that make you want more. Then as the dopamine impairment syndrome, remember we were talking, this is the definition of addiction, grows, more foods like flour for sure will trigger that off. And then eventually even, like I said, dairy, sweeteners. Why would sweeteners? Because it's the anticipation of sweet that the body has, and that's kicking off the dopamine.
Do you find that like you're seeing a lot of people like an end stage food addiction, that they're using and abusing these foods and they're not even really experiencing pleasure from them anymore?
No, because dopamine, I mean, people often talk about this in the literature as the experience of liking something versus wanting it or something like that. You can want something and still not get pleasure from it. This is the common plaintive cry of the addict is I keep wanting this even though I want to stop. I don't actually like it anymore. And that's because the wanting is dopamine. And every time you use something, it's like scratching an itch, you know, the more you scratch, the more itchy it gets. And, you know, it's hurting, you want to stop, but it's still, the itch is so big that you just got to keep scratching. And it becomes a chasing actually to stop that itch or stop that want, but it never does. The only way to stop that want is to actually let it just fizz out, which is hard to do because you're used to chasing and running and doing. And you're actually now being asked to just stop and let it degrade. And that's what we call withdrawal. Lock you up for 3 months or 3 weeks rather, and let it degrade on its own.
Yeah, that must be really hard. And you are a medical doctor and you practice addiction medicine, and that's got to be hard watching people go through that.
Yeah, yes. And you know, in the field of addiction right now, we're ever more focused on harm reduction as opposed to abstinence. So the goal here is now more and more, the person is suffering. We don't know if they're going to stay the 3 weeks. So is there something we can give that will be an alternative that's not as bad? So it might be medication. It might be, well, I mean, in the food industry, it's you know, moderate eating. Can we just give them something else that's not as bad, but still sugar in some way? But it because we don't like to see the person suffer. But it unfortunately it doesn't work, because you'll never stop craving until it's finally degraded. So if you keep substituting and keeping the craving going, you're just prolonging the agony.
Right. That's true. I found that if you give into the craving, you just intensify the craving, and then it's
Yes. Yes, and then you never get over it. And then what people have is a bad memory of this. I don't want to quit because I'm going to live a life of hell, not realizing that that life of hell is actually only 2 or 3 weeks. But if it could have been 3 years if they keep having a little bit all the time, and it just keeps that craving monster ongoing, or that withdrawal. It prolongs the withdrawal so much that it becomes a memory in and of itself that you don't want to go there anymore, you know? I'm not going there.
this whole dopamine thing to me is so fast. I didn't even know what dopamine was until I went to the True North Health Center and met the authors of The Pleasure Trap, who write a lot about this. But do people vary in their sensitivity to dopamine? I mean, do some people just seem to need more, or is it because of the abuse of these foods that requires more?
You know, I think that this is you know, one of the best questions, because there's no answer. I think that we are definitely showing that there's a genetic predisposition. It's not just to sugar, it's to the dopamine. There's a hypersensitivity or a flattening, so that you need more of something to just feel normal. And, you know, we see that there's it's the dopamine 2 receptors that have received the most research, but there's actually more than just dopamine 2 receptors, anyway, that have shown that alcoholism and obesity and food, there's this aberration or change or difference in the dopamine receptors genetically. But we also see that that can change over time, basically over exposure. So if I've been drinking, my dopamine 2 receptors may change. If I've been eating, even if I just gain weight, just obesity itself will reduce or flatten my dopamine 2 receptors, so that I need more food, more booze, more anything to feel better. So it changes through exposure in the environment. What are we doing to our kids is the question that I ask when we give them cereal and all sorts of crap right from the get-go. I fear it's basically like a gateway to other drugs.
Yeah, they say something like at least in the United States, 67% of people eat, you know, boxed cereal for breakfast.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about like a whole grain cereal. We're talking about like Cheerios, you know.
Yes. Not a fan. Not a fan.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that stuff has given grains a bad name. I mean, you know, unfortunate.
That's just crazy. One thing I find is that, like you say, because food addiction in general, it exists on a continuum, is people need to stop comparing themselves to others. Just because somebody tells you that this food is healthy and they can eat it, and they can eat it in a certain amount, doesn't mean that you can. So like what I find, and again, I'm not that popular in the plant-based world with my colleagues, because I respect them and I love their work, but I'm actually working with people that were like myself, that were obese and had suffered, that, like, for instance, we're told that we got to eat nuts, that because they're so healthy, and to eat at least once a day. I know for me, in some ways, nuts are worse than sugar. Not that I'm going to go seek sugar, but I would get, at this point in my recovery, if there was like a little sugar in a recipe, I would probably be fine. But for me, the fat, I mean, one Brazil nut, all I can think about is eating pounds and pounds of pistachios. And I think that's why it's important for people to not compare themselves to others who may be able to have something. And that's why I say, when in doubt, leave it out, and test it yourself. Don't take my word for it. See if it bothers you.
Yeah, although I would, because I'm coming from an addiction framework, I would say test it out, but not with yourself. Test it out with somebody else, because we have an ability to, it's called stinking thinking, to say, like I would, you know, with my, I write about it in my book about the, oh my gosh, the cashews. You know, cashews is fine. Like what's wrong with cashews? And, especially in the keto thing, you can eat as much as you want. And I did eat as much as I wanted. And I just kept saying, it's not that much. Like one little tablespoon was actually 3 big heaping ones. And I could talk myself into the fact that it was healthy and it was fine. If I had done that with somebody else, they would have said, Vera, I don't think so. There's something wrong with this picture when you're willing to run a whole hour just to burn off 1 tablespoon. Come on, there's something wrong with this picture. And it took me actually a year to just go, there's something wrong with this. So in the addiction world, when we're dealing with our triggers, that's why a sponsor is so important. It's just somebody that knows the story, the scene, and how much we can lie to ourselves, and will say, are you sure that this is on, you're having the, it wasn't cashews with you. What was it? It was
any kind of nut, but peanut butter.
Yeah.
When the nut is ground into the nut butter, it's even worse. It's to me.
See, as a sponsor, I would have said, okay, how come you're so keen on having these nuts all of a sudden? And like what's with that? It's just somebody that keeps you in check.
Because they're healthy and they have omega-3 fatty. Yeah, I find that addicts in general and food addicts in particular have a unique ability to lie to themselves.
They do, but the thing about the sponsors is they know the lies.
Yeah, that's great. So, I don't know if this is true because I'm not a doctor or an addiction specialist, but I've heard said that we never technically recover from an addiction.
Right.
We often just transfer it. So I found that when I work with people that are generally overweight in general and food addicted, they don't have a long history of other healthy lifestyle habits, like, for example, exercise. And I'm not shaming or blaming them because I didn't exercise till I was 52. No. But I find it something for me, and I'm not trying to lose weight. I lost these 60 pounds and it's been 8 years now. But I find that if I don't exercise, I don't feel good in my brain. And it seems that whatever happens during vigorous daily exercise, I sit for an hour a day, seems to do something so that I don't have cravings. I don't have longings.
That's right. I mean, it's the same with dealing with issues, our emotions. If we've had our head in the food, we haven't been exercising, we haven't been dealing with emotions in an appropriate way, and we need to learn how to do all that stuff. And that's actually the work of recovery. Is now, how do I live and deal with these emotions? What do I do with all this energy? How do I enjoy my body in a positive way? If you haven't been doing all that stuff because your head's been in the food, yes, exactly. That's the work of addiction, actually.
Well, where do we set that? Because I'm assuming that people from the United States probably can't go to your center.
Right. But sorry, I want to go back. You said, how do you know, can you ever go back? Like once you're an addict, are you always an addict? And I like to say that I believe that is the case. Maybe not physiologically, although I think there are physiological changes that have happened. In the same way as a person who is a diabetic, they may be functionally good blood sugar because they're eating well, but it doesn't take much if they go off their food plan that they're back to being a diabetic. Like they bounce back into that unhealthy way much more quickly than somebody else. Similarly with addiction, you've got those pathways, they're dormant, but they're ready to flare up at the slightest provocation. So I think that I don't think we have a phrase in the addiction world, which is once you're a cucumber pickle, you're never a cucumber. And I do believe that that's true, that once you're there, you got to live now life here. Anything that will bring you back there, it's like a fire that's ready to just flare up. Yeah, I just want to say that.
So I'm assuming that we can't go to your center, those of us. Right. So what is the work of recovery? Is there something in the United? I mean, I recommend people go to the True North Health Center, but they're not a food addiction place. They're just an overall health place. Yeah.
Well, okay. So in my book, Food Junkies, I actually have some resources in there, and I have on my website, which is addictionsunplugged.com, resources there. There are actually a couple of centers in the U.S. that deal with food addiction. They don't actually specifically deal with food addiction, but you can get in there and be treated that way. And there's a couple of outpatient like 5-day things that you can go to that are that deal with food addiction. So look in my book or look on my website. There are more and more Facebook groups. I have a Facebook group called I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar Free for Life, and that's a resource. I think that a lot of people use, and it seems to be well. And there's a few others like sugar detox. There's a few, like check those out. If a person is inclined and they really buy into the addiction paradigm, or they have their own previous history of another addiction, the 12-step programs have food addiction specific, like Overeaters Anonymous. There's something called Gray Sheet Anonymous. There's something called Food Addicts in Recovery Anonymous. And if you go online or even look in my book, you can find some actual 12-step. I like them because they're heavy duty on the support. But everything that I've given you are different avenues. It's possible to get help. It's still kind of spotty. You have to search around. My hope is that over time, as more and more people get trained in the field, we now have an official training in Iceland. Actually, somebody started something up that's very good. I think that in the next few years, we're going to see more and more, but it's not, you still have to hunt around a bit now.
Wow. Well, you definitely were in on the ground floor. So thank you for what you do. I just wish some of the plant-based doctors would take more of an interest in this, because because we're eating differently, meaning lower on the calorie density scale, like the Dr. Rolls discovered, we're eating very calorie dilute foods. We're not often including animal products, oil, and dairy of a high caloric density. We need to eat more food. And just to have enough calories. And that's why for many of us, a weighing and measuring program can't work, because we won't get enough calories. I wish somebody in the plant-based world would have your knowledge and be able to help do what you're doing, but for people that specifically want to recover from food addiction and do it vegan.
Although, can I just say, just to correct you, that I belong to a 12-step program where we do weigh and measure, and like my dinner is 24 ounces of vegetables. So it's.
Oh, that's enough then, because the plan that I get people from, it was 7 ounces, and it's like, oh God, I eat like 2 pounds.
I know. I see yours and I think, oh my God, you and I are very similar.
Oh, that's fantastic.
You have to shop. Basically, you have to shop around to find what you need. But I'm along the same lines as you. I mean, I don't want to be hungry. I'm a volume person. I need to be full. So anyway.
Well, you look great. May I ask, do you exercise as well?
Yes, I do. I do a little bit of weight bear training, like weights, not very much, like an hour, not an hour, a half an hour a week. So not much, but I walk every day. I walk every day about equivalent to an hour, and I do steps. I go, I live in a house of 4 floors, and I literally book 20 minutes where I go up and down those steps. And that, believe it or not, was because I started to get knee pain. And I knew that with physiotherapy, the idea is functionally use the joints or the muscles that hurt until they don't hurt anymore. And that worked. And I just thought, I'm 63. I want to be able to walk and not have knee surgery. So I do that every day.
Well, that's terrific. I don't know if this is true, but you hear these sayings like once a pickle, you never go back to being a cucumber. I've heard some people say that alcohol is liquid sugar and that beer is solid bread. So you had mentioned that the people in the treatment center that were there for maybe drug or alcohol addiction went crazy eating sugar.
Yes.
Would you say that people that suffer from a food addiction, sugar and flour, should also not drink alcohol?
I definitely think that. I think that people who try to get away with a little bit of wine here and there, or even smoking pot here and there, I think they're things. It's not like you relapse into something and you're immediately back. It's a gradual, slow process. And I think a person, there may be a rare few that can get away with it, but you're really inviting trouble. Booze. Yes, it is sugar. It's liquid sugar, but it's also opening up the pathway of the brain that is essentially a gatekeeper. My ability to say no to sugar is weakened when I have a glass of wine. Like, why would I do that? It's like, I always say that addiction is like playing chess against the smarter part of you. And I've now just given my queen away. Like, why would I do that? No.
That's a great analogy. I find that at least the people I've worked with that are self-acclaimed food addicts also they always seem to be addicted to caffeine. They cannot get through the day without caffeine.
Yeah. Yes. Well, what I've heard more is that some people say they have to stop the caffeine really to get the peace. And I have to admit, I'm not a total. I try to restrain my caffeine use, but I do have it in the morning. I don't know. I mean, I don't.
But for some people, that might be a beneficial step.
Absolutely, absolutely. I really, if a person continues to struggle, we have a phrase in the food community which is just look to the food, look to the food, look to the food. What are you still doing that is promoting ongoing cravings? Which could be the caffeine, it could be the sweetener that you, it could be the dairy, the yogurt that you've been thinking was fine. So, yeah.
I love that. What are you still doing that are promoting ongoing cravings? And I find with my people, what they're still doing is living in an unclean environment with family members that are unwilling to lovingly support them in their recovery by keeping these junk foods in the house that could completely derail them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, you see, now we're talking the language of addiction and the tools, recovery tools. And one of the first main recovery tools is people, places, things. You got to stop the people, throw out the phone numbers, move from the person that's putting it in your face. Stop going to the places like the buffets and the movie houses and things. Get rid of the stuff like the boxes of stuff that's in the house. You know, you've out of sight, out of mind. These are all addiction cues and triggers and tools.
Until people start believing this is an addiction. Because, you know, as you know, you've been a guest every year on the Truth About Weight Loss Summit. And while the speakers maybe did not 100% agree about everything, 99% of them agreed about how the environment predicts your success when recovering from it.
Absolutely, yeah. We're social creatures. We are social creatures. I can be very firmly believing in something, but after 3 days of being in an intense environment about something that I don't agree with, I will probably start thinking about it. We're social creatures, and we have to buffer ourselves in ways because the environment, the food environment is so toxic and so relentless. I have to buffer myself to protect myself from that.
Yeah, it does, and it makes such a huge difference. People say, oh, you know, you have so much willpower. I don't have willpower. I mean, I might be due, but not more than anyone else. I just happen to live in a clean environment.
Yes, and you have, and also the work that you do, like you like me, put a lot of effort into creating that buffer. You know, you and I are talking, we're supporting each other's ways of thinking. That's important in the context of, you know, what's happening out there. It's like we're building our own our barricades, which I think we need to do. We have to do them with respect, not with in embarrassment and shame.
Yeah,
we're social beings.
Absolutely. So that finally get off sugar, walk around with these little dropperful bottles of stevia in all kinds of different flavors, chocolate and butterscotch, and then they put it in everything. How do you feel about these 0-calorie or artificial sweeteners like stevia, erythritol, xylitol, mannitol, sorbitol?
Well, they do the same thing that depending on where they promote dopamine, and because they promote the anticipation of sweet, so the body's preparing for sweet even if it's not coming into the body. So there's already a dopamine surge happening just on the anticipation itself. So it's an invitation to it's an eroding of the barricade. It may not actually cause, but if you're already on the tipping point because you're eating a little bit of refined grain or something else, then it could be just enough. Like when we say look to the food, look to the food, look to the food, that might be the thing that's causing the problem. It's not like it'll declare itself like, oh my God, I want more of this now. But you know, it has a dopamine. It has a connect. You have an affection to it. Let's call it that. If you can drop the stevia in and walk away without a sense of, oh, I really like that, maybe you can get away with it. But most of the time, we can't. If a person is at the extreme end, I would avoid it completely.
How does one know what end of the spectrum they're at? Do you do an intake, or is there a test that we can take?
Yeah. No. Well, there's multiple. I want to say that there's the 20 questions of Am I a Food Addict also in my book. The DSM-5 has there's been people in the field, like psychologists and doctors in the field of food addiction, who have developed something called the Yale Food Inventory, which is based on the DSM-5, asking questions to determine where are you on the line. But generally speaking, I think that what we're trying to capture are the basically the dimensions of, do you have a craving that becomes an obsession? Like it takes up a lot of mental real estate in your mind. I want this. I can't wait for it. How will I survive without it? Like that kind of thinking. Is it causing a problem in your life because of health or social, and like you avoid things, or you hate yourself, or you've got diabetes, impairment? Have you tried to control and you can't control? Have you tried to stop and you can't? And if you can put a check mark onto all of those, you're getting closer and closer to the extreme end. And the extreme end will look like somebody who's so obsessed that's all they can think about. Their life is devastated. Like they don't go out anymore. All they do is eat and watch TV or Netflix or whatever. They have severe health issues like arthritis, massive obesity, or what do we call it? Gross obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and they just hate themselves. That's the extreme end. I think we're all sort of on there somewhere, people who struggle with food. But the more you're like that, and the more it takes over your life, that's the extreme end. The same way that a crack addict, all they're thinking about at the extreme is where will my next hit be, and I don't care what my situation is right now if I can get the drug. That's how a food addict thinks.
Yep.
Yeah. It just, we don't see them because they're, in the attics and the basements of our homes or whatever. They don't go out anymore. They order in groceries and whatever, just like booze.
You mentioned about the obsession. So somebody having gastric bypass, they may lose weight and maybe even reverse their diabetes, but it doesn't do anything to help with the obsession.
Well, that's the whole thing. The whole bariatric community. One of the issues that affects that community, not everybody in that community, but a constant refrain is, how do we avoid weight regain? And a lot of times people will say, well, I don't know how to eat, but I find that I'm eating and I don't want to eat. I'm eating more than I want to. And, we've managed here in Ontario, there's a couple of groups that have allowed me to kind of infiltrate into their community, to speak to people who have had post-bariatric surgery, to say, hey, there could be a food addiction happening. And I think that the surgery itself predisposes a person to a more likelihood of becoming an alcoholic. And similarly, they could become more likely to become a food addict because essentially their ability to absorb alcohol and sugar, like liquid sugar, pop, or sugar, flour, is much quicker than it was before. So that they're struggling with an addiction, but we're not calling it yet that in that community. But I think that that's changing. I think we're starting to hear more about this. I really hope we get it in that community because it must be so devastating. You've gone through this surgery only to see the weight come up again.
Yeah.
We're starting to see people getting surgery a second and third time.
Wow. Never dealing with the original, the problem. So I've interviewed some doctors, and I'm not trying to have an argument about this, but there are some people that don't believe addiction is a disease, even some medical doctors. So, but that's not my question. My question is whether you believe it's a disease or it's not a disease, why is there so much shame around it?
That's so interesting because we're getting very comfortable talking about mental health stigma in general. But I think addiction, when there's so much addiction rampant, I mean, speak to anybody, even the most shaming person who says, oh, these people who are cocaine users and why don't they stop eating? They're smoking cigarettes, they're buying stuff. Their addiction is showing itself in a different way. That it doesn't really, we're a very addiction-ophilic. Our society is very much premised on addictive behavior. Well, for God's sakes, there's the whole people joking about, internet binge watching of Netflix and games and Twitter and all that. That's addiction there too. I don't know. This is a rhetorical question that I don't know. I don't want to say it's a conspiracy because we make a lot of money off of each other's addictions. If I'm in business and I'm selling a product that sells itself because it's addictive, I'm making a lot of money. I don't know.
So last question,
Yeah.
what's the recidivism rate like, and is there hope?
Yeah, okay, so the recidivism rate this is exactly the point that you were making earlier. If you can change the environment around you and buffer the constant, persistent pressures to eat food that you don't want to eat, if you can protect yourself from that, like for example, if you're in a 12-step program where you have to go to meetings all the time and you have to call a sponsor every day, call more, like you're basically fitting in all sorts of things to buffer. If you do that kind of work, whatever that may look like, the success rate is actually quite high. And I see a lot of obesity doctors saying, don't tell people to lose weight because they'll always gain it back, and it's just fat shaming and it's so discouraging. And I want to say, you know what? I can give you a handful of 100 people at a drop of a hand who have maintained their weight loss, and they'll say yes because they had to white knuckle it. No, they didn't white knuckle it. They put their energy into changing their environment, like you and I have done and all of our colleagues have done. So the success rate, we say it in the addiction world, if you do the work, it works. But if you don't do the work, the success rate is pitiful. It's 10% if we're lucky. That's in addiction in general. How many people have gone through our program only to come back a second and third and fourth time? Probably 80%. I mean, a lot of people, a lot. And the question is always, what happened? I stopped going to meetings. I stopped calling. I stopped seeing my psychiatrist. I stopped doing whatever it is that was working. So success rate is terrible if you do nothing, except just think it's going to work on willpower. But if you do all the stuff, the tools, and build that environment, get rid of that guy that wants you to eat the crap or drink or whatever it is, everything that you do in that, your success rate is getting better.
That's amazing. Work on recovery and change your environment. This has just been so wonderful. I learned so much from you, and I appreciate your work so much.
Thank you, Chef AJ. I loved speaking with you.
Thank you guys so much for watching Healthy Living. I'm Chef AJ, and I make healthy taste delicious.